we're a bit behind, but yeah, that's 20 minutes.
All right. Is everyone here? Okay, this is a bit of an experiment, but before we start, I just wanted to say I started off today by talking about a situation in Korea where people are boycotting a notable Korean university because they've joined up with a not so notable military company to look at the idea of creating weaponized AI. So I wanted to kick off this discussion, and I want everybody to be a part of this. 'Cause originally, we're going to have a lot of people in here, but having such a small group means that everybody can take part. So we got these guys sitting up here, but I'm going to be wandering around with this microphone. This is an experiment, as I say. We've got about, well, we can take as long as it takes, but we're going to tour the museum afterwards, because there's always people have always said, you know, we really like the conference, but we didn't get a chance to see the museum. So we decided to make time this time for that to happen, with the added benefit that Michael Takeo Magruder's show is also on show in the museum, so definitely worth a walk through. So I wanted to start by asking, should we be afraid or should we be embracing the future of AI? It's going to happen, but is it for good or is it for ill? I'll let you lead off, Beth.
Okay, I'll introduce myself briefly, since I'm not actually speaking till tomorrow. You don't know who I am entirely. So very quickly, I'm Beth Singler. I'm a research associate at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion, and also an associate research fellow at the Centre for the Future of Intelligence, both at Cambridge. Should we be afraid? Well, I tend to veer on the side of thinking of AI as a tool, with the potential for exponential growth after that. At this stage, I think we can see both examples of the benefits and the potential harms of artificial intelligence. It's hard not to get excited about technology that can make things more to enhance our ability to deal with problems like medical issues, cancer diagnosis, to make things run more efficiently, which could save people's lives, could save people's money. And then also we can see the flip side to that very obviously recently with Facebook's sort of attenuation of all our data to be applied in algorithms that are going to distract or direct our attention in particular ways. So it's not hard to find both positive and negative examples. I think existential risk is interesting because it means so many different things to different people. It's not actually a term that finds any kind of concrete groundedness within the community itself, and they're very aware of that. All the people in those pictures discuss existential risk and what kind of directions it might take and what it might look like quite frequently. And that the simplest ideas about AI out of control versus bad actors and whether human influence is actually the thing we should worry about a bit more. I think Dr. Frankenstein came up earlier. When we talk about value alignment for AI, perhaps we should also be thinking about value alignment for scientists and technologists, and whether ethics should be taught along with computer science when these things are going on. So it's not a simple question. I will say I'm neither entirely scared nor entirely hopeful. So there you go. I'm going to sit on the fence like a good anthropologist. Victoria, you want to say anything?
I think theologians would probably also sit on the fence. No, I think a lot of these questions aren't different from existing technologies and who's in control of developing them and using them. So, yeah, I think a lot of the research programs behind AI scare me, and the fact that like sort of military, for example, is behind a lot of the research into sort of doing away with sleep and things like that. So I'm more concerned about where the funding's coming from than AI itself.
I'm going to join you guys on the fence. So I'm also speaking tomorrow. I'm Scott Midson. I'm from the University of Manchester. I'm doing a postdoc at the moment called Living with and Loving Machines, and I'm looking at love and technologies. I don't think we should be afraid of sort of AI. I think we should be healthily cautious maybe, or critical. I think the biggest danger is that we would sleepwalk in something that we're not quite aware what we're doing. And that's probably not something to be afraid of, just something to be aware of more than anything else. I don't think I think, what we're doing with our technologies, I mean, there's a lot of concerns at the moment. So I look at love and care. There's a lot of concerns that robots are going to sort of replace humans in caring relationships. There's Paro the seal. There's a lot of concern that, Paro is going to sort of take humans out of the equation because you can just give your relative this animatronic seal, and that's going to sort of take the companionship and take over those kind of parts. And I think if we functionalize parts of that kind of relationship and then we offset it then to machines and robots, that's where we should be a bit more concerned and cautious. It's not the machine itself, it's what we're doing with it. So that's why I look at love and what kind of values we want as humans, as post-humans, and what kind of things we want our technologies to do with us and not just for us. Yeah.
I am worried for the future, but I'm worried more about mass extinction. The fact that there are half as many fish in the ocean as there were 60 years ago strikes me as a much bigger threat than the hypothetical scenario where robots take over the world. I am not particularly concerned about robots taking over the world. The blue screen of death that I grew up with on computers tells me that robots that want to take over the world are likely to dysfunction all by themselves. That said, I am concerned about some of the peripheral outcomes. I mean, when you talk about the roboticization of the military, and that's not really about funding, because the military is going to take advantage of any good technology it can. In fact, they're the happier if they didn't have to pay for it to have it developed. So it's not just a question of funding, it's a question of use. And when you look at making war easier, more palatable, I think that's where I become very concerned, because it would be in the wealthiest nations where military machines would be most prevalent. And then that means that the wealthiest nations would be in a position to enforce their will even more powerfully on other nations, because they wouldn't have the human consequence of having to apologize when soldiers die, right? And I speak because I come from a country which has a more than healthy military approach to the globe, right? And doesn't necessarily apologize when people in foreign lands die. They apologize when their own soldiers die. So if all of a sudden they didn't have their own soldiers, they just had a whole bunch of robots, that would terrify me on behalf of the world. But that's a legitimate concern, I think, in the near-term future. We can legitimately be worried about autonomous weapons, because you can already program a drone to drop a bomb to choose its own target. There are already drones that can do that. And so that's a here and present kind of danger that strikes me as much more disconcerting than whether or not robots are going to take over, or whether we're going to give up our humanity in some sort of post-human cyborg future or transcendent apocalyptic future where we live as robots or what have you. I mostly think the apocalyptic AI stuff is just fun to talk about and think about. I'm not deeply concerned about it as a historical outcome.
Do any of the presenters have a response to the question?
David? Well, just a quick one, really. I think there's awful lot of nonsense talked about killer robots, right? I mean, without actually looking at, the fact that soldiers kill each other all the time, accidentally and deliberately, right? And so it's never framed as a question of statistics. It's just framed as a question of horror, with people imagining the Terminator films and all the rest of it, right? So they're already, like, Kalashnikov's already built this killer robot, right? But it's bound to be lousy, right? It's bound to be dangerous to both itself and other people, right? So it's a question about, like, self-driving cars, right? Self-driving cars are great because people are lousy drivers, right? And if you can kill less people with self-driving cars, you're still going to kill children, but you're going to kill less children, right? And so my own opinion about killer robots is, if killer robots are going to kill less civilians and inflict less collateral damage and screw up the infrastructure less, then that's a good thing, right? And that's a statistical case. It's not a case about imagining the Terminators taking over the world, right?
I absolutely agree with you in the sense of what actions it might undertake within a theater of war. My concern is that there might be an expansion of theaters of war if the human cost becomes less relevant, right? It's really a question of, will we fight more wars, right? Rather than, will a machine perhaps be better within the, humans are terrible in those situations. What are we going to do? If your life is constantly being threatened, you are likely to pull the trigger before thinking about it. if you're walking with a gun and you know there is a threat to your life. And a robot could make that scenario better. And that would be delightful, as long as it doesn't also just lead to more military intervention.
And I think I'm probably a little bit concerned about invisible killer robots, which sounds very science fiction, but I'm going to explain what I mean by invisible killer robots. So when algorithms make decisions, very anthropomorphic, but the setup of an algorithm to provide a service, so Facebook adverts, so forth, are chosen at high speed. That doesn't have a huge amount of impact on us yet, but we already have the concept of priority lanes. If we go down the road of more automation for things like transport, services, is there the same prioritization, the Prime membership you get with Amazon, does that spread out into our day-to-day lives where algorithms make decisions based on our class, our gender, the discrimination that we already kind of recognize in these systems, and we've talked about different kinds of algorithmic racism. Does that extrapolate out to more automated systems? If you're driving if you're in an automated car and you're not a priority service person, do you get there slower than someone else? Does that have a knock-on effect to people's lives? That could be an invisible killer robot. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Any other presenters? Okay, let's all the way from Berlin.
Thank you. I just wanted to add up on this. There are machines and there are algorithms to take decisions that affect our lives, and these are algorithms that interpret financial data, and they actually decide which kinds of financial derivatives or whatever to buy and which ones to sell. It is probably already affecting our lives.
Oh yeah, certainly people have argued that the financial crash has been in part due to bot systems. So absolutely, yeah. I'm not saying this is near future invisible killer robots. I'm saying it's now.
In the United States, it's already been demonstrated in a number of areas that the software banking institutions have used to determine who gets a home purchase mortgage, that software is actually racist, which is stunning, right? I mean, on the one hand, it's built by human beings. And human beings, either implicitly or explicitly, are frequently racist, right? So maybe it's not surprising that we built that into the algorithm for deciding who gets to buy a home or not. But it's also shocking that we couldn't have seen past that and had software that allows you to buy homes dependent upon your financial capacity to buy them, and not based on the color of your skin and where you want to buy that home and so forth.
Just to pick up on the point that Robert has made, I think one of the problems is there's still a kind of perpetuation of a mystique associated with the computer, a kind of seductiveness at work. I mean, in one aspect of my work, I'm increasingly looking at the algorithmic and technology more generally as a site of seduction. I mean, the very idea of the black box, you don't know what goes inside, but it seems to do really interesting stuff or scary stuff or whatever stuff. But if you can convert the black box to a white box, pop the lid, look inside, the question is, what do you find inside? And I think there's still a tendency to think about code, software, algorithms, and the associated data in engineering terms. If we were to shift the discourse and think about it more in, say, linguistic terms, what we might be seeing is language. And in the same way that we're quite familiar with the use of racist language, in pejoratives, etc., then it becomes easier to think about how race might be embedded in technologies. If we start thinking about the software as language itself, because it's just a form of racist discourse, a technologically articulated form, but nonetheless I would suggest a discursive manifestation of racism.
Okay, David?
Yeah, just to comment on the racist algorithms, right? I suspect, I might be wrong, that they kind of reflect the the racist society of America, right? That they're presumably not coded to be it's not some guy sitting down with a spreadsheet, right? It's inferring the patterns that exist, that black people are more likely to go to prison, whatever, because the society has long historical bias, right? And so that relates to your point as well, right? That it's the algorithms sort of hoover up what exists and then perpetuates it and then imposes it back on people, right? So more generally, yeah, we need to keep an eye on what these algorithms are doing. I agree with that, right? And for both of the points that you made.
Just sort of picking up on that, moving from sort of algorithms to chatbots. Michael was talking about chatbots earlier on, and that's where I find the Microsoft example of Tay really quite sort of significant, because it's that kind of reflection of what we're putting into it that's kind of coming back and then making us panic. So so anyone who doesn't know, Tay was a sort of Microsoft designed Twitter profile handle thing, and she was designed to be like a sort of 16-year-old teenage girl. She was meant to kind of learn as she interacts with people, but she became increasingly sort of misogynistic, homophobic, sort of racist, anti-Semitic, all really, really kind of the cess parts of humanity and everything. And it was pulled instantly. And, Tay was kind of made in our image through the people that were interacting with her. There were trolls online. There was a kind of concerted effort to sort of bring it down and kind of defile the sort of things that she's saying. But as an interruptive moment in how we're kind of interacting with technologies, it shows us what we're putting into it and what we're getting back. And it's kind of a useful way to think about things like algorithms and other things that we're interacting with on a daily basis.
And I think also that there's two other narratives in relation to algorithms that are worth thinking about. One is the assumption that they are superior and they will always provide the rational outcome, which is obviously where we don't always see their bias, and therefore biased outcomes can be ignored in the immediate moment. And also the mystification of them goes to the extreme. I saw a tweet the other day from an Uber person who drives for Uber and saying, "Today the algorithm blessed me. I got a good series of rides to take people on, and I made some money, and today the algorithm blessed me." And I'm not saying he's now worshipping the algorithm, but that mystification of the process, that it's picking and choosing in particular ways. Maybe that is the next step. I do talk about AI religions as well.
I think that links with what you were saying about seduction, as well as that kind of that positive side and that negative side, and that's where our hubristic kind of stories come to us, because it's what we want is actually going to be the downfall of our future or whatever. So I think that's where that mysticism comes into it.
Anybody else want to comment on this? Coming over, Michael, and then back to you, Mustafa.
In relation to the discussion about algorithms, tying them to a language and inherent biases, I suppose just to nuance that a bit more, to locate a bias within a particular geographical location at this point is problematic, insofar as this is a global network. So sure, you can sort of create an algorithm. It's going to have a bias, a particular one at that. But once it's out of your control. Others are engaging with it. And also, too, as others are engaging with it, that bot is operating as well. My point being is that, of course, we can look at a place like America. I mean, I'm Canadian, so I, exist insofar as I am not American, and I can say, well, that is the quintessential example of racism or bias or whatever. But actually what we're seeing now within a global network is we're seeing global bias and discourse, and how that is out of control once it's out there. So I just want to nuance the discussion a bit to say that to locate it in any one geographical location is problematic. And therefore, also, too, we need to acknowledge how much of this is out of our control, because a crash one place in a market is a crash everywhere, right? Disinformation in one area can be disinformation in every area. And I think that is probably the more intimidating fact that we're seeing, is the illusion of control actually is being shown for what it is.
I just to throw an optimistic gloss in there, when you were speaking, I couldn't help but remember the movie When Harry Met Sally in the 1980s, when Harry hits on Sally, and then they got to get back in the car and drive. And Sally says, well, I can't just forget about it. It's already out there. And Harry says, oh, no, what are we going to do? It's already out there, and makes this big joke out of the whole thing. But the upside of all this is that it also means we can deploy positive technologies really effectively as well. And to speak to the question of automobiles, for example, we're talking a lot in the US right now about the one person who died in a car accident when a self-driving car crashed. But thousands of people die every single day in cars driven by people. So, you know, there are some much more optimistic ways of thinking about this also, that the good things are also going to be out there, and perhaps even in a way that they can't be taken back. And that would be a great thing. I'm thinking in the U.S., for example, we think about the activities of unions, which for a long time worked very hard to get a lot of rights for workers. And then those rights have been systematically taken away, right? They were removed in a fight against unions. So there might be a really positive side of things that are kind of out there in a way that nobody can even do anything about them anymore. We just have to figure out how to emphasize those technologies, and how do we advance human flourishing in all countries for all peoples as best we possibly can.
Okay, so I want to take the discussion somewhere else now a little bit, and speak back to one of the central ideas in apocalyptic AI discourse, which touches on probably a number of the presentations that we heard during the day, which is to do with effectively immortality. So, you know, the mind uploading scenario, or the, you know, periodic shifting between bodies, assuming that a body is still important, depending on whichever particular strain of this fantasy ontology you happen to subscribe to. And I'm currently reading a book called Delete, The Virtue of Forgetting in the Digital Age. It's an old book from about 2009. That's old. And what I particularly like, I'm just over halfway through this book, and the thing that really struck me about the argument, and it's quite a simple argument, and it's essentially saying that up until relatively recently, the norm was to forget. The exception was to remember. But with the onset of digitization, things have rotated 180 degrees. The norm is now to remember, and the exception is to forget. Now, what I'm interested in thinking about here is the idea of long durée data trails and asymmetries, algorithmic asymmetries, in terms of who has access to the data, who is able to weaponize the algorithms and different data sets in a convergent sense for what projects. I think that the author of this particular work makes an interesting case, which is, I think, for the idea of information or data having a use-by date or a shelf life, that it shouldn't be allowed to persist forever. Because, as he rightly argues, I think it's a sound argument, that if you have effectively these persistent data trails, it actually blocks the possibility for growth, change, development, and ultimately to have a future. In other words, you colonize the future by perpetuating an ever expanding persistent data trail. Now, that might sound counterintuitive because, you know, the way it's pushed by futurists, singularitarians, apocalyptic AI proponents is, well, you know, this horrible wet stuff that we're made of, you know, it's frail, it's brittle, and wouldn't it be great if we had this memory that never forgot anything? Well, you know, the question is, well, I'm not sure whether it actually would be great, because, I mean, he gives a really good example of an interaction between two friends, a male and a female, and how they knew each other, you know, over a number of years. Initially, their relationship was good, and then it went through a bad patch, and they kind of broke off their friendship, but then they resolved it. And after a long time, one contacts the other to say, shall we meet, have coffee? And it's like, yeah, let's do that. That's great. And then they read the email trail, persistent long-term data trail. And then they start going through the fact that, oh, our exchange was really bad, and he said this, and she said this, and et cetera, et cetera. And the point that he's making here, the author of the book, is that this now starts to occlude the possibility of living in the present in a potentially constructive future. The burden of the past weighs heavily on the present, and possibly even forecloses the future. Now, I'm not saying that is necessarily the case, but it seems to me that we hardly ever even consider that possibility. Now, if you entangle that with the idea of an Internet of Things where, because I would actually suggest there was already an Internet of Things before the Internet of Things, and that Internet of Things was the other. Their land, their languages, their knowledges, their people, etc., etc. In other words, they were just stuff. They were resources in a global network. The Internet of Things today, as we know, is essentially technologically focused. But the question is, who is actually wiring the world? Who is embedding sensors everywhere? Who is actually going to benefit from this? Particularly given the fact that we might have to entangle that question with this idea of persistent data trails that scupper the possibility for acting in the present and possibly foreclosing the opportunity for futures as opposed to the future.
Yeah, I'm wondering how that is categorically different to the way we use memory now. There are lots of things that concern me about the kinds of data that are collected on us and that are stored and that are available to other people. But I mean, I can go through my emails now and dredge up old disagreements if I want to, or I can just use what I remember. You know, that's still there to a certain degree, so it might be more accessible, but that hasn't precluded us in the past from choosing what we attend to. So the memory is there, whether I recall it and dwell on it or whether I reorient my thinking. Can't we do that with data as well?
Before we go back as well, I just wanted to provide a small data point and a counter example, perhaps two counter examples. Data point is all your MySpace data. If anyone here had MySpace, I did, certainly. All your MySpace data just got sold to another corporation who can commercialize it. So if you suddenly start seeing adverts that seem particularly nostalgic to you, there's a reason. And counter examples, I agree that perhaps that if people are trying to move forward from a past, that they perhaps did things that weren't necessarily who they are now, that might be problematic. But I think Trump is a really strong counterexample to that we heard him say things. I mean, I'm not American, so I don't really have a horse in the race, but we heard him say things. Well, we all do, I think. He's an existential risk. And yet people were willing to vote for him, having heard those things, and they were explicitly against what they proclaimed their morals to be. And he went on and had a future as a president. There's also a writer recently who's been hired by, I'm trying to remember, Huffington Post, maybe, Washington Post. It's going to come back to me later. And he has stated in the past, in more than one medium, that any woman who has an abortion should be hung. And he's been given this job, this has come out, and the newspaper, the magazine involved has said it doesn't matter, it's something he said in the past. So there are counter-examples of views that butt against what we consider to be mainstream liberal views, and people still continue to have futures. So I'm not sure all cases will be exactly the same, and people's reaction to and treatment of past comments that appear on social media, that appear on YouTube or appear in the news will always be the same and preclude any kind of future if we can remember them.
Okay, Jay's got a comment you'd like to make.
That's a really interesting point, and I think speaking directly to what you were saying is it brings up a question of fidelity and of, I guess, yeah, if we're dealing with long array of data, how can those things be altered through time? And then, you know, that's the big question for a lot of these people is, you know, how could someone believe, you know, or vote for Trump even after all the things that he said? Well, it's because a lot of these people just don't trust the kind of the past data points. So I guess to look back at, you know, what you were saying is how can, you know, interfacing with this book delete, which sounds quite interesting, is, okay, well, we'll get this massive trail of data that's going behind us, but at what point, you know, how do people actually trust and interface with that? And I think that's the question that a lot of people are dealing with right now is questions of fidelity in that data trail. So I don't know if that's something to deal with here.
Just quickly, I think the question of fidelity on some of these things at the moment is less of a concern because we know these things at the moment we know these things were said and done for various different instances. What I'm also concerned about is the manipulation of past data points. So increasingly machine learning, there's various examples of Bush, Obama, their words being replaced with technology. That concerns me. So we may lose that fidelity. I think at the moment we're not quite there in that terrifying scenario, but yes, it's potential. Our pasts could change too.
We kind of are because there was the recent in our country, the shooting in Parkland, and there's a young woman who's been a very outspoken advocate against gun rights, and she had a video of herself tearing something up. I can't remember what it was, but it had to do with the National Rifle Association or what have you. And someone with sophisticated skills went in and changed the video to make it look like she'd torn the Constitution in half. So then all of a sudden, people who want to believe that these kids all hate America or what have you, they now have the ammunition to believe that. They're like, look, there's a video of her tearing up the Constitution. We are entering a place where we're going to have to question almost every single piece of it. There might be a positive spin there, that all of a sudden, if people can just learn to be suspicious in a productive way, where when we're told things, we actually want to think about them for a moment and say, is it really plausible that that 18-year-old put a video of herself on YouTube tearing up the Constitution? Is that really a plausible scenario, right? And that might lead us to a more democratic universe if we can start being more and more thoughtful as a consequence of the fact that data are manipulable in so many ways.
Okay, Michael, you wanted to jump back in?
Just a counterexample to the counterexample, which actually speaks to what you brought up, which is the hinge of trust, actually. Who we are willing to trust and not trust reflects our own bias and reflects who we are willing to forget what they did and who we are not. So to bring it into this realm, look at Jeremy Corbyn. Look at the amount of stuff that's dug up on him. I mean, the recent picture that they had with him with the sort of typical Russian hat, and they have Russian imagery in the back on the BBC, or pictures of him being dragged out of protests, and how he's smeared for that. Now, I'm not saying that we should all trust him, but actually our lack of trust for Corbyn reflects our own bias. And likewise, the trust in somebody like President overseas reflects a bias. And so it's in their interest to trust that person or not, because it reflects their deep-seated bias. But the deeper issue is about person-to-person trust and who we are willing to look at and say, I forget the wrongs you've done, right? But that's formed on a fidelity. So a friend of mine, if they wrong me, I'm able to say, it's okay, right? You've hurt me, but I forget it. But if there's no basis of trust, then there's really no possibility for dialogue. And that is just as true in the socio-political realm. I think that's the problem, is we're willing to trust one particular person that sort of reflects our view, but we're not anybody else. We can't even talk anymore. So just a counterexample to the counterexample.
Okay. Just right over here.
To all of this, but I've got a friend who works in an organisation that employs ex-offenders, and they're already hitting this problem now, that offenders with quite minor convictions that by law are spent after a certain period of time, future employers are Googling them. Everybody who comes, and their offences, even if they're 10 years ago, are now showing up, and they are finding it increasingly difficult to get work, and are ultimately going back to crime because they cannot get employment. And that, many of the examples we've talked about are the rich and powerful. These are not the rich and powerful. These are people whose lives are already, and that's just going to get worse, isn't it? It's not going to get better. So it's already having negative impacts on people.
Yeah, we need to think about the most vulnerable people and find ways to enhance things for them. Right? I mean, that's an incredible. In our country, there are states of our country that you can't even vote anymore after you've been incarcerated. And that's outrageous to suggest that in a democratic nation you can revoke the right to vote. But so we do need, and you know, maybe we can get some technological solutions that actually will help people in this regard and not just hurt them.
Mustafa and then David.
I just want to build on the example that's been cited here most immediately. You can then, it's almost like a pre-crime scenario at work here, because the example of people who are facing that problem, if that then spreads in the sense of people become conscious of the implications that, well, if you commit this crime, it's not that you serve the time and then it's erased, but no, this is actually, you carry this with you forever, effectively. That is going to have an impact on the future behavior of people in terms of avoiding certain types of action in the world. Now, we might link it to criminal activity, but, you know, there's slippery slope between that and maybe protest action. That, you know, if I protest in a particular so-called democratic setting, I may be denied housing, I may be denied employment, I may be denied healthcare. When that experience ripples out more generally, that will have an effect on the population. And eventually, what I'm suggesting is will happen is a collapse of futures into future. And that future is, to some extent, determined by that ever-expanding persistent data trail. Now, the point I was making, just to respond to, I think it was the theologian who was responding to me bringing up this example of from this book, Delete. I never claimed that the issue was to do with the individual, their self-perception regarding whether they read the email or they don't read the email. Clearly, well, at this stage, we still have that option open to us. The point is other perception. In other words, how we are perceived increasingly by the other, and how the other might be institutional, it might become expansive, encompassing, you know, whether it's at the level of the state or whether you go global. A wiring of the world, a kind of almost like a global panopticon, you know, to use kind of Bentham's metaphor. I actually prefer the plantation overseer. It's that kind of matrix model where, you know, we're all plugged into this machine and it's just siphoning off what it likes from us. But I mean, these are apocalyptic scenarios, but I actually think we should always conjure up the worst case scenarios and try to check them. Because to some extent, I mean, what if Heidegger was right about this idea that the long history of Western metaphysics from the pre-Socratics right up to Nietzsche, and I actually include Heidegger in this, that it was about an increasing technologization of the world. I mean, I think when he wrote The Question Concerning Technology, it was originally delivered in 1947, published in Germany in 1954, first English translation in 1977. And he was talking about cybernetics and how, you know, effectively pointing to information circulation. And I mean, I think about these things, and the aporia in Heidegger's whole discourse is that he doesn't link this to the idea of a colonization of the life world. He just doesn't, he can't see that perhaps. You know, he's so Eurocentric in his reading of the Western philosophical tradition that he can't see the implications for the other and how that might reflect back onto the self because of the cybernetic loop which drags everything into its ambit.
Okay, I do think we should keep in mind that technological determinism, from an historical standpoint, is basically falsifiable. I mean, people act and they make changes. Technologies do not dictate the future. So we should be a little more optimistic than that. I mean, it sounds so horrific the way you frame it, that we're going to go from a plurality of futures to just one future, and it's going to be wretched. But apocalypticism is optimistic. So, you know, we do have the potential to intervene politically, philosophically, scientifically, artistically. We're never going to be condemned to just one vision of the future, I think.
Okay. David, you wanted to?
Sorry, can Victoria come back on that one? Because she was directed to. So
Yeah, no, I just want to say, sorry, I'm not shifting it onto individuals so much as I think it feeds into what people are saying about trust. And almost we have this infobesity scenario where there's so much data out there that the trust comes in. We all have done things and said things that we know can be read out of context. So I think most of us are able to project that onto others as well. And isn't that a scalable thing? I mean, possibly there is some scenario where there is an other that uses every single thing that everyone has ever done that could be taken out of context and represented negatively. But the more that happens, I think the more people stop trusting that kind of system and stop giving it power. So I'm not entirely convinced that we won't deliberately make choices to forget things or to interpret information with suspicion, as has been mentioned.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think data can be, I mean, I don't buy that example, by the way, because obviously they shouldn't get together and they should get together with someone else, right? I mean, so the data is really useful at that point. But anyway, my main point is the data has many different uses, often unexpected, right? So, I mean, the example I can think of is like Google flu trends, right? Which is a bunch of emails or whatever. I don't know how they dug it out, but they kind of did bad predictions as it turned out. But, you know, by looking at a bunch of data that they hoovered up from a large number of sources, they can then make predictions that could potentially save lives and so on and so forth, right? And possibly could pull out climate data, plastic use data, all kinds of really useful stuff from these enormous data trails. And if you don't keep the data trails, just as some kind of blanket rule that after a year they all deleted, then you're just losing a whole bunch of useful things as well, right? So you need to have a much more, yes, maybe with this EU right to be forgotten stuff is something to bear in mind, but on the other hand, you know, there's many positive uses of these long data trails, I'm trying to say.
Any responses up there? No? We've got about 10 minutes, okay, just to let people know. I think this has been a good experiment, and I'm going to finish with you.
Two very quick questions. One, where are you getting the idea that apocalypticism is optimistic? Second, can you substantiate your claim that determinism has been definitively falsified?
So apocalypticism is optimistic in almost every single text we might call an apocalyptic text. The revelation of the end is almost inevitably towards a glorious new future. So they are optimistic, not necessarily about the fate of all people, right? Like it may be only optimistic about our little in-group and everybody else is out of luck. But apocalypticism as a mindset is positive for at least a few people. In terms of the question of technology and historical determinism, historians of technology have looked for specific moments of intervention where people have seemingly changed the course, because you can look at places where people say, this technology is going to do this to the world. All you have to, I can't give you any specific examples off the top of my head, but all you have to do is find predictions of what technology is going to do to the world, and then you note how those predictions are almost always wrong. That when people extrapolate from the known technology, we do it badly, and that all kinds of other interventions come into play that produce different futures than we anticipated.
Okay, you had a comment over here.
I have been wondering for a while now where labor is in this whole thing, human labor, because obviously we all know that the development of intelligent machines will at some point or another do away with most of the need for human labor. And we are already facing a situation where especially white male labor becomes superfluous, basically. Or at least the things white men used to do become superfluous. And yeah, I just wanted to ask what you think about this.
Yeah. I think this is a fascinating topic, and the ways in which it is imagined are fascinating. My own perspective on this, I think I'm a little bit more of a pessimist on this specific aspect. I said earlier I'm a little bit on the fence, but when it comes to the future of work, I am very concerned because we're not all going to suddenly leap into luxury space communism a la Star Trek. We're going to have to go through a lot of painful stages if we're in, Star Trek, do not take that as a prescription for the future. It doesn't work. None of the economy in Star Trek works at all. It's just made up. But we're going to have to go through some really painful steps to get anything like the utopian future that some people talk about in terms of post-work. I think the most predictive text that I think is reasonable is WALL-E, and then that's a contained situation on a starship, but where humans are relieved of work and don't know what to do with themselves, and entertainment is the purpose they put themselves to, or they put entertainment to a purpose to fulfill their lives. They get really fat and they float around, and the robots do all the interesting things. So that is the thing I'm probably a little bit more pessimistic about. I think we need to be asking the questions now, not necessarily about things like universal basic income, which I'm not enough of an economist to actually work out how that works, but we need to be asking the question more fundamental to that: what is a human being for, and what do we do with ourselves when we don't define ourselves by work anymore? I introduced myself earlier by who I am and where I work. Would I do that differently in a post-work future? Would we even have a situation like this? What does it look like? I don't know.
I guess, like, theologically, a lot of kind of things that talk about the sort of labour, leisure kind of balance, a lot of theological resources turn to the sort of Sabbath day and the sort of value in leisure, but it's also got to be supplemented by kind of work and, performing the image of God in that sense and everything. Moving away from the theological kind of discussion, I guess, so robots are kind of associated with work and labour, and that's kind of, where some of the earliest stories we have about them are to do with the kind of world of work. So, Rossum's Universal Robots, Metropolis, they're all about this world of work. And I think one of the things that kind of worries me a little bit more than the replacement of jobs is the kind of roboticization of jobs, so the roboticization of human workers. So, for example, in Amazon's big warehouses, humans are basically becoming not even cyborgs, but robots. They're kind of given a route to go to the next package, and they have a time limit to get it in, and their performance is measured against these quantifiable data sets. And I think that is probably more worrying than anything else. It's that kind of...
Well, it's a first step to replacement.
Well, it's
a gradual step.
But as a first step, it's that sort of turbulent, kind of worrying thing that we're kind of already at. So I think the replacement narrative is only one part of it. There's a lot more kind of going on behind the surface.
When I read Hans Moravec's Mind Children for the first time, this is a book that's described as mind-blowing and, shattering to your worldview. And the thing I thought was most mind-blowing was not people uploading their minds into robots and living forever. It was that he believes that in the short term, the advent of intelligent machines means that human beings will revert to what he calls a comfortable tribalism and live a happy paradisical life. I was stunned by his assertion that we would have universal shareholder, that we would be universal shareholders in the robot companies, so that when the companies did all this work and they generated all this wealth, we'd all be just fine. I thought that was the most mind-blowing thing he said, because I was thinking, people who own robot companies, if their robots get really, really valuable, probably anticipate getting really, really rich and not handing over company ownership to the rest of us. So I admit to being kind of pessimistic on this count also.
Okay. I think that would be a good point to end. You need at least an hour to go through the museum. It's a fabulous museum, so I encourage everybody to go through. We'll reconvene tomorrow at same time, same place. Quick show of hands, how many people are joining us tomorrow? Excellent. Okay, and hopefully there'll be some more as well. So thank you so much to our little panel here, and thank you to all of you people who spoke and who didn't speak, all contributed, and it's been a wonderful day. Thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow.